Son, could you pretend to be my boy? Just for today? The old man's voice trembled as he stood beside the biker's booth, clutching a worn manila envelope against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The diner had gone strangely quiet. Outside, rain slid down the wide windows in long silver streaks. A line of motorcycles stood parked along the roadside, big chrome machines glistening under the gray afternoon sky. Their engines had gone silent minutes earlier, but the presence of the riders still filled the room like distant thunder, waiting somewhere beyond the hills. The biker in the booth slowly looked up. He was a large man with a thick beard streaked with silver and a black leather vest patched with the emblem of the Iron Road Brotherhood. His name was Marcus Hale, and people in 3 counties knew not to cross him. But the old man standing beside the table wasn't afraid, just desperate. Marcus studied him for a long moment. The old man's shoulders were thin beneath a faded army jacket. His hair was white and combed carefully back, the way men from another generation still did. His hands shook slightly as he held that envelope. Marcus finally spoke. "You asking me, old-timer?" The man nodded slowly. "My name is Thomas Carter," he said quietly. 75, served 2 tours overseas. He paused, swallowing. "And today, I need a son." A few bikers in nearby booths exchanged glances but said nothing. Thomas leaned closer, lowering his voice. "My nephew is coming here soon," he explained. "He's bringing legal papers. Says I just need to sign them and everything will be easier." His fingers tightened around the envelope. "But I've read enough to know easier for who." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Thomas continued. "He thinks I'm alone. Thinks I don't have anyone left who'd question him." The old man hesitated, then said the words that had clearly taken courage to speak. "So I wondered if for one afternoon you might pretend to be my son." For a moment no one spoke. Only the quiet sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the diner. Marcus leaned back slowly in his booth. "You walk into a biker joint," he said, voice calm, "and ask the biggest guy here to play family." Thomas nodded. "I figure bikers understand loyalty," he said softly. The words hung in the air. Before Marcus could answer, the waitress approached with a pot of coffee. Her name was Rachel, and she'd been serving riders along this highway for nearly 20 years. She set the pot down carefully and looked between the 2 men. "Marcus," she said quietly, "you might want to hear the rest." Marcus glanced at her. Rachel lowered her voice. "That nephew of his," she said, "name's Daniel Carter. Been around here twice already this week asking questions about the old man's house, and he didn't look like a man planning a family visit." Marcus's jaw shifted slightly. "What kind of questions?" Rachel crossed her arms. "Property value, land rights, how often the old man comes to town?" She shook her head. "The kind of questions people ask when they think someone's about to disappear." A long silence followed. Marcus looked back at Thomas. The old veteran stood patiently, still holding that envelope. Rain rolled down the windows behind him like the slow passage of time. Marcus finally slid out of the booth. The scrape of the wooden seat against the floor echoed through the diner. Several bikers looked up immediately. Marcus stepped closer to Thomas. For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached out and pulled the empty chair from the table. "Sit down," he said. Thomas blinked in confusion. Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder and guided him gently toward the seat. "Go on," Marcus added. Thomas sat slowly. Marcus turned and looked around the diner. Every biker there was watching now. Marcus rested one hand on the table and spoke clearly. "Everyone," he said, "meet my father." The room remained quiet for a second. Then one rider at the counter gave a low whistle. Another chuckled softly. Thomas looked up at Marcus, eyes wide. Marcus simply poured him a cup of coffee. "You said you needed a son today," Marcus said calmly. He pushed the cup toward him. "Well, I know, congratulations, Dad." Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he took the cup. "Thank you," he whispered. Marcus leaned back against the booth, folding his arms. "So," he said, voice steady, "tell me about these papers your nephew wants you to sign." Thomas slowly placed the envelope on the table. Marcus opened it and scanned the documents inside. The pages were full of legal language, dense paragraphs and tiny clauses. But one line stood out immediately: transfer of property ownership. Marcus looked up slowly. He wants your house, Marcus said. Thomas nodded. And the land around it, he added quietly. Been in our family since 1946. Marcus exhaled slowly. At the far end of the diner, another biker leaned toward his friend and muttered, "Sounds like someone picked the wrong afternoon." Marcus folded the papers neatly and set them back in the envelope. "Don't worry about those," he said. Thomas looked uncertain. "But he'll be here soon," the old man said. Marcus gave a small nod. "Good." Outside, thunder rumbled softly beyond the hills. Marcus reached for his coffee and took a slow sip. Then he glanced toward the diner entrance. The doorbell jingled as a car pulled into the parking lot. Headlights swept across the row of motorcycles like curious eyes. Rachel peeked through the window and murmured quietly, "Looks like company." Marcus set the cup down. Thomas's hands trembled again. Marcus noticed. He placed one steady hand over the old veteran's wrist. "Relax," Marcus said calmly. "You're not alone anymore." Then the diner door opened, and the nephew walked in. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply as it swung open. A gust of damp wind followed the two people stepping inside, carrying the smell of rain and wet asphalt with it. The man who entered first wore a neat gray coat and polished shoes that clicked confidently against the diner floor. Behind him walked a tall woman in a beige jacket, holding a leather folder tightly against her side. The man's eyes immediately began scanning the room. He wasn't smiling. This was Daniel Carter, Thomas's nephew. And beside him was his wife, Linda. Daniel's gaze stopped the moment he saw the row of motorcycles through the window. Chrome fenders, leather saddlebags, heavy engines still ticking softly as they cooled. Then he looked inside the diner and saw something that clearly wasn't part of his plan. Nearly every booth was filled with bikers, leather vests, gray beards, calm eyes watching quietly. Daniel hesitated for just half a second, but then he straightened his coat and walked forward as if nothing about the situation bothered him at all. Thomas saw him first. The old veteran's shoulders stiffened slightly. Marcus noticed. Without turning his head, he spoke softly. "That him?" Thomas nodded. "Yes." Daniel walked toward the booth, smiling the way men do when they believe they're completely in control of a situation. "Uncle Thomas," he said warmly. "There you are." Thomas forced a small smile. "Daniel." Linda nodded politely, though her eyes moved quickly across the room, clearly uncomfortable with the number of bikers present. Daniel stepped closer to the table. Then he noticed Marcus sitting beside the old man. He frowned slightly. "And this is, Daniel asked. Marcus didn't rush to answer. He simply reached for his coffee cup and took a slow sip. Then he set it down and leaned forward on the table. "I'm his son." The words landed in the air like a quiet thunderclap. Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry." Marcus's expression didn't change. "You heard me," he said calmly. "Name's Marcus Hale." He extended a hand across the table. Daniel hesitated before shaking it. Marcus's grip was firm, not aggressive, just solid. The kind of handshake that left no confusion about who you were dealing with. Daniel pulled his hand back slowly. "I didn't realize Uncle Thomas had family in the area," he said carefully. Marcus shrugged. "Family shows up when it's needed." A few bikers nearby nodded quietly. Daniel cleared his throat. "Well, that's actually perfect timing," he said. "We just need Uncle Thomas to sign a few documents today." Linda opened the leather folder and placed several neatly prepared pages on the table. Marcus glanced at them. The same paperwork he had already seen. Transfer of property, power of attorney, asset authorization. The kind of legal language designed to overwhelm someone who trusted the wrong person. Daniel tapped the papers politely. "Just a few signatures," he said. "Then Uncle Thomas can relax and let us take care of everything." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus leaned back slightly and crossed his arms. "Take care of what exactly?" he asked. Daniel smiled again, though the expression had become tighter. "The house, the land, the taxes. You know how complicated things get at his age." Marcus nodded slowly. "I see." He picked up the first sheet and read a few lines. Then the second, then the third. The diner had grown so quiet that even the rain outside sounded louder. Finally, Marcus placed the papers back on the table. Then he did something that made Daniel's smile disappear completely. Marcus picked up the entire stack and slowly tore it in half. The ripping sound echoed across the room. Daniel's face went pale. "What are you doing?" he snapped. Marcus calmly tore the papers again. Then again. Small white pieces drifted onto the table like snow. "That," Marcus said quietly, "is not happening." Linda gasped softly. Daniel's voice rose immediately. "Those are legal documents." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "And that's my father sitting right there," he replied. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You have no authority here." Marcus looked around the diner slowly. Every biker in the room was watching now. A few had folded their arms. Others simply sat calmly, drinking coffee. Marcus turned back to Daniel. "You see all these men?" he said. Daniel didn't answer. Marcus continued. "Every one of them rode here today because they believe in one thing." He tapped the table once. "Family." Thomas stared at Marcus, overwhelmed. Marcus continued calmly. "Now, if you think you're walking in here and tricking an old veteran into signing away his home," he leaned a little closer, "you're going to have a long afternoon." Daniel looked around the diner again. The quiet attention of the bikers suddenly felt much heavier. Linda tugged slightly at his sleeve. "Daniel," she whispered. But Daniel wasn't ready to retreat yet. He forced another smile. "Uncle Thomas," he said, trying to sound patient, "you know this is just for your benefit." Thomas slowly shook his head. "No," he said quietly. Daniel blinked. Thomas's voice grew steadier. "I think I'll keep my home." Daniel's expression hardened. "This isn't over," he muttered. Marcus gave a small nod. "You're right." He leaned back again. "It isn't." Daniel gathered the torn pieces of paper angrily. Linda avoided looking at anyone as they turned toward the door. The bell jingled again as they stepped out into the rain. Their car engine started seconds later. The headlights disappeared down the highway. For a moment, the diner remained silent. Then someone at the counter clapped once. Another biker joined. Soon the entire room filled with warm applause. Thomas covered his face with his hands. His shoulders began shaking. Marcus gently placed a hand on his back. "You're all right," he said quietly. Thomas lowered his hands, tears running down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered. Marcus reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small prepaid phone. He placed it on the table. "One number's programmed in there," Marcus said. Thomas looked down at it. "What number?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Mine." He pushed the phone toward him. "Call any time, day or night." Thomas stared at the phone for a long moment. Outside, the rain was finally starting to slow. Inside the diner, the bikers returned to their meals and conversations. But something had changed, because none of them knew it yet, but that simple afternoon had just created a family. Thomas Carter sat quietly in the diner booth long after Daniel's car had disappeared down the wet highway. The applause from the bikers had slowly faded, replaced again by the gentle sounds of coffee cups, low conversations, and rain tapping softly against the windows. But Thomas hadn't moved. He simply stared at the small prepaid phone resting on the table in front of him. Marcus noticed. The big biker leaned back in the booth, watching the old veteran carefully. "You all right, Dad?" he asked in a calm voice. Thomas let out a slow breath, the kind of breath a man releases when a heavy weight finally lifts from his shoulders. "I think so," he said quietly. His hands were still shaking slightly. Marcus poured him another cup of coffee. Rachel, the waitress, returned with a warm slice of pie and set it down in front of Thomas without asking. "On the house," she said gently. Thomas looked up at her. "That's very kind," he said. Rachel smiled. "Any father of Marcus here is family to this diner." A few bikers chuckled softly at that. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "You boys really didn't have to do all that," he said quietly. Marcus shrugged. "Sure we did." Thomas looked up. Marcus continued calmly. "You walked into a room full of bikers and trusted us with something important." He tapped the table once. "That kind of trust deserves respect." Thomas nodded slowly. For a moment, he just looked around the diner. Men in leather vests sat at booths, drinking coffee, laughing quietly, telling road stories. Most of them had gray in their beards now. The kind of men who had spent decades riding long highways watching seasons change across thousands of miles of open road. They didn't look like dangerous outlaws. They looked like old soldiers who had simply chosen motorcycles instead of uniforms. Thomas cleared his throat. "You know," he said softly, "I used to ride a little myself." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" Thomas nodded. "Not like you boys. Nothing fancy." He smiled faintly. "Just an old Harley I bought after I got back from overseas in the 70s. A biker at the counter turned his head. "Harley, huh?" the man said. "What model?" Thomas thought for a moment. "72 Shovelhead," he answered. The biker whistled. "That's a classic." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "What happened to it?" Thomas smiled, though there was a little sadness in it. "Sold it when my wife got sick," he said quietly. "Hospital bills don't care much about sentimental things." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Fair enough." Thomas looked down again at the phone Marcus had given him. "I'm still not sure why you helped me," he admitted. Marcus chuckled softly. "You kidding?" Thomas looked confused. Marcus gestured around the diner. "Half the guys in this room are veterans, too." Several bikers nodded quietly. Marcus continued. "You wore that old army jacket in here like it still meant something." He tapped the patch on Thomas's sleeve. "To us, it does." Thomas looked down at the patch. It was faded now, but it still carried the symbol of the unit he had served with decades earlier. He hadn't thought anyone noticed it anymore. Marcus did. "So yeah," Marcus said simply. "We helped." Thomas swallowed hard. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose I owe you boys dinner someday." The biker at the counter laughed. "You bring the food, we'll bring the motorcycles." The room filled with soft laughter. For the first time that afternoon, Thomas smiled properly. Marcus glanced out the window. The rain had almost stopped now. The sky was clearing slowly, and thin lines of sunlight were beginning to break through the clouds over the highway. Marcus stood up. "Come on," he said. Thomas blinked. "Where?" Marcus nodded toward the door. "Walk with me." Thomas stood slowly and followed him outside. The air smelled fresh after the rain. Rows of motorcycles stood shining along the curb. Large touring bikes, old cruisers, a few custom machines polished like mirrors. Thomas looked at them with quiet admiration. "Haven't stood this close to bikes like these in years," he admitted. Marcus walked toward his own motorcycle. It was a deep black Harley with wide handlebars and a powerful engine. He rested a hand on the seat. "You ever miss riding?" Marcus asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. He just watched the motorcycles. Then he nodded. "Every spring," he said quietly. Marcus smiled slightly. "Well," he said, "spring's coming again." Thomas chuckled. "Son, I'm 75. Marcus shrugged. "And?" Thomas laughed softly. "You bikers are something else." Behind them, the diner door opened, and several members of the Iron Road Brotherhood stepped outside. They leaned against their bikes, stretching their legs, enjoying the fresh air. One of them, a tall rider named Derek, nodded toward Thomas. "Your dad seems all right, Marcus." Marcus smirked. "Yeah, tough old guy." Thomas shook his head. "I'm not actually his—" Marcus raised a hand gently. "Doesn't matter," he said. The other bikers nodded. Thomas looked around at them. Something warm stirred in his chest. He hadn't felt this kind of belonging in a very long time. After a moment, Marcus turned back to him. "You live far from here?" he asked. "About 15 minutes, Thomas said. "Little farmhouse just outside town." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Good." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Why good?" Marcus looked down the highway for a moment. Then he spoke calmly. "Because guys like your nephew don't usually quit after one try." Thomas's smile faded slightly. Marcus continued. "And if he comes back with a different plan—" He looked around at the bikers standing beside their motorcycles. "He's going to find out something important." Thomas waited. Marcus finished the sentence. "That old farmhouse of yours isn't unguarded anymore." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "You boys don't have to." Marcus shook his head. "We know." He glanced at the other riders. Derek nodded. "So do we." Thomas looked at the group of bikers standing quietly beside their machines, men who had known him for less than an hour. Yet somehow, they had already decided something important. They had decided he was one of them. Marcus turned back toward the diner. "Come on, Dad," he said casually. "Let's finish that pie before it gets cold." Thomas followed him slowly, and for the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel lonely anymore. For the next few days, life returned to its usual quiet rhythm for Thomas Carter, at least on the surface. The old farmhouse sat at the edge of a gravel road just outside town, surrounded by a few acres of land that had belonged to his family for generations. The wooden porch creaked in familiar places, and the wind still moved through the tall trees the same way it always had. But something felt different now. Thomas noticed it the first morning after the diner incident. He had just stepped outside with a cup of coffee when he heard the distant rumble of a motorcycle approaching along the country road. At first, he assumed it was someone simply passing through, but the sound slowed. Then it stopped. Thomas walked toward the edge of the porch and looked down the gravel drive. A large touring bike sat there, engine idling quietly. The rider wore a black helmet and a leather vest with the emblem of the Iron Road Brotherhood stitched across the back. The biker lifted a hand and gave a friendly wave. Thomas blinked in surprise. The rider killed the engine and removed his helmet. It was Derek. "Morning, Mr. Carter," Derek called out. Thomas walked down the porch steps. "Morning," he replied. "Everything all right?" Derek smiled. "Just passing through." Thomas looked at the empty road behind him. "You drove 15 miles down a dead-end road just passing through?" Derek shrugged. "Nice view out here." Thomas chuckled. "Well, you're welcome to some coffee if you want." Derek didn't hesitate. "Don't mind if I do." They sat on the porch for a while, drinking coffee and talking about simple things: weather, motorcycles, the changing seasons. After about 30 minutes, Derek stood up. "Well," he said, placing his helmet back on, "I should get moving." Thomas nodded. "Drive safe." Derek started the engine and rolled slowly down the gravel driveway. But Thomas noticed something curious. About 10 minutes later, another motorcycle appeared. This time it was a blue cruiser. The rider was another member of Marcus's club. "Just checking the road conditions," the man said casually when Thomas greeted him. Thomas smiled to himself. By the third motorcycle that afternoon, the pattern was impossible to ignore. They weren't just passing through. They were watching over him, and somehow, that knowledge brought a strange comfort. Over the next few weeks, the visits continued. Sometimes it was Marcus himself. Other times it was different members of the club. They never stayed long. Just a short conversation, a cup of coffee, a quick look around the property. Then the familiar sound of a motorcycle engine fading back down the road. Thomas began to realize something. These bikers weren't guarding him out of obligation. They were doing it because they believed it was the right thing to do. One evening, about 3 weeks later, Thomas decided to return the kindness. He had spent most of the afternoon cooking. A large pot of homemade chili simmered slowly on the stove, filling the farmhouse with the warm smell of spices and tomatoes. He packed the chili into a large metal container and carefully placed it in the passenger seat of his old pickup truck. Then he drove toward the edge of town. Marcus had mentioned once where the Iron Road Brotherhood kept their clubhouse. It wasn't hard to find. The building stood beside a long stretch of highway, a sturdy brick structure with a large garage attached to one side. Several motorcycles were parked outside, their chrome reflecting the evening sunlight. Thomas pulled into the lot and stepped out of the truck. For a moment, he wondered if he might be interrupting something important. But before he could second-guess himself, the clubhouse door opened. Marcus stepped out. He looked surprised for half a second. Then he smiled. "Well, I'll be," he said. Thomas lifted the metal container. "I brought dinner." Marcus laughed warmly. "Now that's the kind of surprise we like." Within minutes, several bikers had gathered outside. Someone grabbed bowls. Someone else brought spoons. They sat around a long wooden table inside the clubhouse while Thomas served the chili. The room was filled with the low hum of friendly conversation. Motorcycle parts lined the walls. Old photographs hung in frames. Pictures of long road trips, charity rides, and riders who had passed on but were clearly still remembered. Marcus tasted the chili and nodded with approval. "That's good," he said. Another biker raised his bowl. "Real good." Thomas watched them eat and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt useful. For years after his wife passed away, most evenings had been quiet and lonely. Now here he was, sitting in a room full of laughter and motorcycle stories. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "So," he said, "you finally found the clubhouse." Thomas nodded. "Figured it was time I returned the favor." Marcus raised his bowl slightly. "You already did that the moment you trusted us?" Thomas looked around the room. "These visits you boys keep making, you don't have to keep doing that." Marcus shrugged. "We know." Thomas smiled faintly. "Still." Marcus leaned forward. "Let me explain something, Dad." Thomas listened. Marcus gestured toward the riders around the table. Most of these guys spent years out on the road. Long miles, hard winters, tough situations. The other bikers nodded quietly. Marcus continued. "And one thing you learn after enough miles is that nobody should ride alone if they don't have to." Thomas felt his chest tighten slightly. Marcus smiled. "So we don't leave family alone." The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Derek raised his bowl. "To family." The other bikers followed. "To family." Thomas lifted his own bowl slowly. For the first time since his wife had passed, the word didn't feel like a memory. It felt like something real again. But miles away, in another part of town, Daniel Carter was sitting in a lawyer's office, and he was not ready to give up his plan just yet. Across town, inside a quiet office that smelled faintly of polished wood and paperwork, Daniel Carter sat stiffly in a leather chair. The blinds were half closed against the late afternoon sun, casting long stripes of shadow across the desk. In front of him sat a lawyer named Richard Bellamy, a man who had built a reputation in the county for handling complicated property matters. He wore thin glasses and held a pen loosely between his fingers while listening to Daniel's explanation. Daniel had been talking for several minutes. "And then this biker just tears the documents apart," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Right there in the diner, in front of everyone." Bellamy leaned back slightly in his chair. "You said your uncle has full ownership of the property?" "Yes," Daniel replied quickly. "But he's elderly. He doesn't understand the financial burden of maintaining it." Bellamy tapped the pen gently on his desk. "Mr. Carter," he said calmly, "age alone doesn't invalidate someone's ability to manage their own affairs." Daniel frowned. "But he's vulnerable." Bellamy lifted one eyebrow. "And the presence of several bikers prevented him from signing?" Daniel hesitated. "Well, yes." The lawyer placed the pen down. "Then it sounds less like a legal matter and more like a family disagreement." Daniel's patience was beginning to thin. "You don't understand," he said. "That land is worth a fortune. Developers are already asking about it." Bellamy folded his hands. "And your uncle wants to sell?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Bellamy nodded slowly. "I see." The room grew quiet. Finally, Bellamy spoke again. "If your uncle refuses to sign anything voluntarily, your only option would be to prove he is mentally incapable of making decisions." Daniel's eyes brightened slightly. "And that's possible?" Bellamy shrugged. "It's difficult. Judges require strong medical evidence." He paused, studying Daniel carefully. "And they rarely take kindly to family members trying to force property transfers." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "So you're saying there's nothing I can do?" Bellamy spoke carefully. "I'm saying the situation could easily turn against you if handled poorly." Daniel stood up slowly. "I'll figure something out," he muttered. Bellamy didn't respond. As Daniel left the office, frustration burned in his chest. Everything had been simple before that afternoon at the diner. His uncle had been alone, an aging man with no children, no close relatives nearby, and a valuable piece of land. It should have been easy, but now those bikers had complicated everything. Daniel stepped outside into the evening air. His car was parked along the curb. He stood beside it for a moment, thinking. Then he made a phone call. Meanwhile, 20 minutes outside town, the atmosphere at the Iron Road Brotherhood Clubhouse was warm and relaxed. The large pot of chili Thomas had brought was nearly empty. Several bikers sat around the long wooden table, still talking and laughing. Thomas listened to a story Derek was telling about a cross-country ride he had taken years earlier. "And the snow came down so hard we couldn't even see the road," Derek said. Marcus here kept riding like he had built-in headlights. Marcus chuckled. You exaggerate. Thomas smiled. I used to love those long rides, he said quietly. Marcus glanced at him. Used to? Thomas shrugged slightly. Life changes. Marcus didn't press the subject. Instead, he stood and walked toward a shelf along the wall. When he returned, he placed an old photograph on the table. Thomas leaned closer. The picture showed a group of bikers standing beside a row of motorcycles on a mountain road. The photo looked at least 15 years old. You see that guy there? Marcus said, pointing. Thomas nodded. That's Sam Walker, Marcus explained, one of the founding members of this club. What happened to him? Thomas asked. Marcus smiled faintly. He retired from riding a few years ago. Health reasons. Thomas looked thoughtful. Still part of the club? Marcus nodded. Always. Thomas slowly pushed the photograph back across the table. You boys really take that family idea seriously. Marcus met his eyes. Absolutely. At that moment, another biker walked into the room carrying a small cardboard box. Mail delivery, the man announced. Marcus looked surprised. Who sends bikers packages? The rider set the box on the table. It's addressed to Mr. Carter. Thomas blinked. To me? Marcus turned the box so Thomas could see the label. Sure enough, the name Thomas Carter was written clearly across the top. Thomas carefully opened the package. Inside was a thin folder. He pulled it out and opened it. His smile faded slightly as he began reading. Marcus noticed immediately. What is it? Thomas handed him the papers. Marcus scanned the first page. His jaw tightened. What does it say? Derek asked. Marcus answered quietly. Formal notice. The room fell silent. Marcus continued reading. Daniel Carter has filed a petition with the county court requesting a competency review. Thomas frowned. What does that mean? Marcus placed the papers down carefully. It means your nephew is trying to convince a judge you're not capable of managing your own life. The room grew very quiet. Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, he said softly. Marcus studied the papers again. If the court agrees to the review, he said, they'll send a medical evaluator to examine you. And if they say I'm not competent? Thomas asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, then someone else gets control of your property. Derek shook his head. That's low. Thomas rubbed his forehead. I spent 30 years paying off that farm, he murmured. Marcus looked around the room. Every biker present had the same serious expression now. Finally, Marcus spoke. Well, he said calmly, if Daniel wants to start a fight in court, he tapped the papers once. And then we'll make sure he picked the wrong family to mess with. Thomas looked at him. You boys don't have to get involved in legal trouble. Marcus smiled slightly. We're not. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Marcus folded the notice and handed it back. We're just going to do what families do. Thomas waited. Marcus finished the sentence. We're going to show up. The morning of the court evaluation arrived quietly. The sun had barely risen over the rolling hills outside town when Thomas Carter stepped onto the porch of his farmhouse with a cup of coffee in his hands. The air was cool, carrying the soft scent of wet grass and early spring. For a long moment, the old veteran simply stood there, listening to the peaceful sounds of the countryside. Birds chirped in the tall oak trees near the road, and somewhere in the distance, a tractor engine hummed to life. But despite the calm morning, Thomas felt a knot of tension sitting deep in his chest. Inside the house, the letter from the county court still rested on the kitchen table. Competency evaluation, 10 a.m. He knew what it meant. Daniel had decided to fight this battle in a different way. Instead of tricking him into signing papers, his nephew now wanted the court to decide that Thomas was too old to control his own property. Thomas had spent nearly his entire life working for that land. Now someone was trying to take it away with paperwork. He took a slow sip of coffee. Just then, a familiar sound reached his ears. A motorcycle engine. Thomas glanced toward the road. A large touring bike appeared through the trees, rolling steadily along the gravel. The rider slowed as he reached the driveway. It was Marcus. Thomas smiled slightly. Marcus parked beside the porch and removed his helmet. Morning, Dad, he said. Thomas chuckled softly. Morning. Marcus climbed the porch steps and accepted the extra cup of coffee Thomas had already prepared. You ready for today? Marcus asked. Thomas shrugged. I suppose so. Marcus leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the quiet countryside. Courtroom stuff can be intimidating, he admitted, but the truth usually wins. Thomas nodded. I hope so. For a few minutes, they simply stood there in silence. Then another motorcycle engine echoed down the road, and another. Thomas turned his head. Two more riders approached the farmhouse. Derek was one of them. Behind him rode another member of the Iron Road Brotherhood. They pulled into the driveway and parked beside Marcus's bike. Derek removed his helmet and waved. Morning, Mr. Carter. Thomas looked at Marcus. You didn't have to bring the whole club. Marcus smirked. We didn't. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Just then, the distant sound of more motorcycles rolled across the countryside. The rumble grew louder. Thomas walked slowly to the edge of the porch and looked down the road. A line of motorcycles was approaching. 5, 10, 15 riders, all wearing the same patch on their vests. The Iron Road Brotherhood. They rode calmly, one after another, engines humming steadily as they turned into the long gravel driveway. Within minutes, nearly 20 motorcycles stood parked near the farmhouse. Thomas stared in amazement. You boys planning to invade the courthouse? He asked. Marcus laughed. Relax, we're just giving you a ride. Thomas blinked. A ride? Marcus nodded toward a sleek black touring bike parked nearby. Court's in town, he said. Figured we'd travel together. Thomas shook his head slowly. I haven't been on a motorcycle in 30 years. Derek grinned. Well, he said, today seems like a good day to fix that. Thomas laughed softly. I don't think my bones are built for that anymore. Marcus shrugged. We've got a helmet your size. For a moment, Thomas looked uncertain. Then he glanced down the quiet road. 20 motorcycles waited there, engines silent now, riders chatting calmly. They had all come just to accompany him. The gesture touched him more deeply than he expected. Marcus stepped closer. You don't have to ride, he said gently. But if you want to... Thomas thought for a moment. Then he smiled. All right, he said. The bikers quickly found an extra helmet. Marcus helped Thomas climb carefully onto the back seat of the touring bike. The engine roared softly to life. One by one, the riders started their motorcycles. The driveway filled with the deep rumble of engines. Marcus glanced back. Comfortable? Thomas nodded. Let's see if this old heart still remembers the road. Marcus smiled. Trust me, he said. It does. Moments later, the line of motorcycles rolled down the gravel road. Neighbors peeked from their windows as the riders passed. It wasn't a loud, reckless parade, just a calm, steady procession moving toward town. By the time they reached the courthouse square, people were already staring. 20 motorcycles pulled neatly into parking spaces along the street. Engines shut down one after another. Thomas stepped off the bike carefully. His legs felt slightly shaky, but his eyes were bright. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. Ready? Thomas nodded. Across the street, a sleek sedan had just pulled up. Daniel Carter stepped out. He froze when he saw the row of motorcycles lining the courthouse. One by one, the bikers removed their helmets. Daniel's confident expression slowly faded. Marcus leaned slightly toward Thomas and spoke quietly. Remember, he said. Thomas looked at him. Marcus finished the sentence. You're not walking in there alone. The courthouse steps felt taller than Thomas Carter remembered. He had been inside that building only a handful of times in his life. Once for jury duty, once to settle a property line dispute years ago, and once more to register the deed after finally paying off his farm. But today felt different. Today he wasn't walking in alone. Marcus stepped beside him, steady and calm, while the rest of the Iron Road Brotherhood followed a few paces behind. The rumble of their boots on the pavement echoed softly in the quiet courthouse square. People nearby paused to watch. It wasn't every day that nearly 20 bikers arrived at the county courthouse together. Yet there was nothing threatening about their presence. They simply walked together, quiet and respectful, like men who understood the weight of the moment. Daniel Carter watched from across the street. His confident expression from earlier had disappeared entirely. Linda stood beside him, whispering something under her breath as she glanced nervously at the group of riders approaching the courthouse entrance. Daniel, maybe we should rethink this, she murmured. Daniel shook his head quickly. No, he said quietly. It's just a show. But even he didn't sound convinced. Meanwhile, Marcus leaned slightly toward Thomas as they climbed the courthouse steps. Remember what I told you, Marcus said calmly. Thomas nodded. Just tell the truth. Marcus smiled faintly. That's usually enough. Inside the courthouse lobby, the atmosphere was quiet and formal. Wooden benches lined the walls, and the faint smell of paper and floor polish hung in the air. The clerk at the front desk looked up as the group entered. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of so many leather vests, but Marcus approached calmly. Morning, he said politely. The clerk adjusted her glasses. Good morning. Marcus gestured toward Thomas. Mr. Thomas Carter is here for the competency review. The clerk glanced down at a list. Yes, that's scheduled for 10 o'clock. She looked up again, noticing the riders standing respectfully behind him. Are all of you accompanying him? Marcus nodded. Just here for support. The clerk hesitated for a moment. Then she smiled gently. Well, please have a seat. The evaluator will be ready shortly. Thomas sat on one of the wooden benches. Marcus sat beside him. Across the lobby, Daniel and Linda took seats of their own. The distance between the two groups felt enormous. Daniel tried to appear calm, but his eyes kept drifting toward the line of bikers filling the benches. Derek leaned toward Marcus and whispered quietly. Looks like our friend didn't expect company. Marcus shrugged. People rarely do. Thomas folded his hands together. I hope this doesn't cause trouble for you boys. Marcus shook his head. We're not causing anything. Thomas looked around the room again. You know what I mean? Marcus smiled. Dad, we're just sitting. That made Thomas chuckle softly. A few minutes later, a door opened at the far end of the hallway. A middle-aged woman stepped into the lobby holding a clipboard. Her name badge read Dr. Helen Morrison. She looked around the room. Mr. Thomas Carter? Thomas stood up. That's me. Dr. Morrison smiled kindly. Good morning, Mr. Carter. I'll be conducting your evaluation today. Thomas nodded politely. Marcus gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You've got this. Thomas followed the doctor down the hallway. The door closed behind them. The remaining bikers settled quietly on the benches. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Finally, he stood and approached Marcus. You really think this changes anything? Daniel asked quietly. Marcus looked up calmly. Changes what? The legal process, Daniel replied. This is a medical evaluation. Your little biker club doesn't matter here. Marcus leaned back against the bench. You're probably right. Daniel frowned slightly. Then why are you all here? Marcus answered simply. Because he asked for a son. Daniel shook his head in frustration. You're not his family. Marcus met his eyes. Funny thing about family, he said. Daniel waited. Marcus continued calmly. Sometimes you're born into it. Then he gestured toward the hallway where Thomas had disappeared. And sometimes you choose it. Daniel had no reply. He returned to his seat. The waiting room fell silent again. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Finally, the hallway door opened. Thomas stepped out beside Dr. Morrison. The old veteran looked calm, though slightly tired. Dr. Morrison approached the clerk's desk and spoke quietly with her for a moment. Daniel leaned forward anxiously. Marcus remained relaxed. After a minute, Dr. Morrison turned toward the room. Mr. Carter, she said. Thomas looked up. Yes? She smiled warmly. I see no medical reason to question your ability to manage your own affairs. The words hung in the air, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Daniel's face turned pale. Thomas blinked in surprise. You mean? Dr. Morrison nodded. You're perfectly capable of making your own decisions. Marcus grinned. Derek clapped quietly once. Several bikers exchanged satisfied looks. Thomas let out a slow breath. Daniel stood up quickly. That's ridiculous, he snapped. Dr. Morrison looked at him calmly. Sir, my evaluation is based on medical standards. Daniel clenched his jaw. Marcus watched him carefully. Finally, Daniel grabbed Linda's arm. Let's go. They stormed toward the courthouse exit. The door slammed behind them. For a moment, the lobby remained quiet. Then Derek stood up and smiled. Well, Dad, he said, Thomas looked at him. Derek finished the sentence. Looks like you won round one. Thomas chuckled softly. But Marcus wasn't smiling anymore. Because he knew something important. Men like Daniel Carter rarely gave up that easily. And somewhere outside that courthouse, Daniel was already thinking about his next move. The courthouse lobby slowly returned to its normal quiet rhythm after Daniel Carter stormed out the front doors. Thomas Carter stood for a moment beside Marcus, still trying to process what had just happened. You're saying that's it? Thomas asked softly. Dr. Helen Morrison smiled kindly. As far as my evaluation goes, yes, she said. You are fully capable of making your own decisions. Thomas nodded slowly. Thank you, Doctor. She gathered her papers. Take care of yourself, Mr. Carter. Marcus shook her hand politely as she passed. Appreciate your time. Within a few minutes, the Iron Road Brotherhood stepped back outside into the bright, late-morning sun. The courthouse square looked peaceful again. Birds fluttered near the fountain in the center of the plaza, and a few people walked casually along the sidewalks as if nothing unusual had happened that morning. But the row of motorcycles parked along the curb still drew curious looks. Thomas stood beside Marcus's bike, taking a deep breath of fresh air. Well, he said quietly, I suppose I owe you boys another dinner. Derek laughed. At this rate, we're going to need a bigger table. The riders chuckled. Marcus turned toward Thomas. You did the hard part in there, he said. All we did was sit. Thomas smiled. Sometimes sitting beside someone means more than doing something. Marcus nodded slightly. That was a truth every biker in the Brotherhood understood. The group lingered for a few minutes, chatting casually in the warm sunlight. But Marcus eventually glanced down the street where Daniel's car had disappeared earlier. His expression grew thoughtful. Derek noticed. You think he's done? Derek asked quietly. Marcus shook his head. Men who chase money like that rarely stop. Thomas overheard the conversation. You think Daniel will try something else? Marcus answered honestly. Probably. Thomas sighed. Well, I suppose life would be boring if things were easy. That earned a few smiles. The riders soon started their motorcycles again. Engines rumbled one by one as they prepared to head back toward the clubhouse. Marcus handed Thomas the spare helmet again. Ready for the ride home? Thomas chuckled. I might get used to this. The bikes rolled out of the courthouse square in a calm procession. But as the group rode down the highway, none of them noticed the dark sedan parked several blocks away. Inside that car, Daniel Carter sat gripping the steering wheel tightly. Linda sat beside him, clearly nervous. Daniel, she said quietly, maybe we should just let this go. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stared down the road where the motorcycles had disappeared. Finally, he spoke. You don't understand, he said slowly. Linda waited. That land isn't just farmland, Daniel continued. Developers want it. They've already made offers. Linda frowned. But if your uncle won't sell, Daniel cut her off. He will. His voice had grown cold now. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. How? Daniel didn't answer. He simply started the car. Meanwhile, the Iron Road Brotherhood reached the outskirts of town. Marcus pulled off the highway near a small roadside diner, the same diner where Thomas had first walked in weeks earlier, asking for help. The group parked their motorcycles in the familiar row outside. Rachel, the waitress, stepped out onto the porch when she heard the engines. Well, look who's back, she said with a smile. Thomas climbed off Marcus's bike. Thought we'd stop for lunch, Marcus said. Rachel nodded approvingly. After a courthouse trip like that, you boys probably earned it. Inside the diner, the atmosphere felt warm and familiar. Thomas slid into the same booth where everything had started. Marcus sat across from him. Rachel brought coffee for everyone, without even asking. So, she said, leaning slightly on the table. How'd it go? Thomas smiled. The doctor says I'm still stubborn enough to run my own life. Rachel laughed. That sounds about right. The riders relaxed as they ate lunch together. Stories filled the air again. Laughter returned. But in the middle of the meal, Marcus noticed something. A man had entered the diner quietly and taken a seat near the window. He wasn't eating. He wasn't talking. He was simply watching the table where Thomas sat with the bikers. Marcus studied him carefully. The man wore a plain jacket and held a small notebook in his hands. Every so often, he scribbled something down. Marcus leaned toward Derek. You know that guy? Derek glanced over briefly. Nope. Marcus continued watching. Finally, the man stood up and walked toward the exit. As he passed the booth, he gave Thomas a polite nod. Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. Thomas blinked. Do I know you? The man smiled faintly. Not personally. He paused near the door. My name is Jonathan Reed. Thomas frowned slightly. And what do you do, Mr. Reed? The man opened the door. I investigate financial complaints for the county. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Reed continued calmly. We received an anonymous report regarding a possible property exploitation case involving your nephew. Thomas looked surprised. An investigation? Reed nodded. Just routine questions. Then he stepped outside and disappeared. The diner grew quiet for a moment. Derek looked at Marcus. Anonymous report? Marcus simply sipped his coffee. He hadn't made that report, but someone clearly had. And somewhere in town, Daniel Carter was about to discover something important. When you try to take advantage of the wrong man, the road sometimes pushes back. For a few days after the courthouse evaluation, life in the small county town returned to its usual rhythm. The spring weather continued to warm, farmers began preparing their fields, and the familiar sound of motorcycles occasionally rolled along the highway near the diner. But behind the calm surface, things were quietly shifting. Inside a modest office at the county administrative building, Jonathan Reed sat at his desk reviewing a growing stack of documents. The folder in front of him was labeled, Carter, Thomas, Property Inquiry. Reed wasn't the kind of investigator who rushed to conclusions. He had worked for the county for nearly 15 years, and he had learned that most disputes over property were simply family arguments that could be solved with patience and paperwork. But this case felt different. The anonymous report that had arrived a week earlier was unusually detailed. It mentioned attempts to pressure an elderly veteran into signing documents, transferring ownership of valuable farmland. It mentioned a nephew named Daniel Carter. And it mentioned several suspicious financial inquiries made by real estate developers about the same piece of land. Reed leaned back in his chair, thinking. Then he picked up the phone. Across town, Daniel Carter sat in his living room, staring at his own stack of papers. Linda stood near the kitchen doorway, watching him quietly. You've barely slept, she said softly. Daniel didn't respond. He flipped through the pages again. Property estimates, development offers, letters from investors. The numbers were enormous. That land outside town had become extremely valuable over the past few years. A new highway project had been approved just a few miles away, and developers were already planning housing communities and shopping centers nearby. Thomas Carter's farmhouse sat right in the middle of it all. To Daniel, it looked like opportunity. To everyone else, it looked like greed. Linda sighed. Daniel, this is getting out of control. Daniel finally looked up. I'm not losing that land because of a bunch of bikers and an old man's stubborn pride. Linda hesitated. But there's an investigation now. Daniel frowned. What investigation? Before Linda could answer, the phone rang. Daniel picked it up. Hello? Mr. Carter, a calm voice said. This is Jonathan Reed from the county office. I'd like to ask you a few questions regarding your uncle's property. Daniel's stomach tightened. Questions about what? About the legal documents you attempted to present to Mr. Carter last month. Daniel forced his voice to stay calm. I was simply helping my uncle manage his finances. Reed paused for a moment. Perhaps, he said, but we've received concerns that the documents may not have been explained clearly. Daniel's jaw clenched. This is ridiculous. Reed remained polite. Maybe so, but I'd still like to speak with you in person. Daniel glanced at Linda. When? Tomorrow morning, Reed replied. Daniel hesitated. Fine. The call ended. Linda folded her arms. See? This is exactly what I was afraid of. Daniel stood abruptly. Relax. They have nothing. But deep down, he wasn't as confident as he sounded. Meanwhile, life at the Carter farmhouse had become surprisingly lively. Thomas stood in his kitchen stirring another large pot of chili. The window above the sink looked out toward the gravel road, and he smiled when he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. Two bikes rolled into the driveway. Marcus and Derek stepped off and walked toward the porch. Thomas opened the door before they even knocked. "You boys came right on time," he said. Marcus grinned. "Smells like chili again. Figured the clubhouse crew might be hungry?" Derek laughed. "At this rate, we're going to start charging admission." They stepped inside and Thomas poured coffee while the chili finished cooking. The farmhouse felt warmer now than it had in years. Photographs lined the walls. Old army pictures, family portraits, and recently a few snapshots someone from the club had taken during their rides together. Marcus noticed one new photo hanging near the hallway. It showed Thomas standing beside a row of motorcycles outside the clubhouse. "You're becoming part of the history," Marcus said. Thomas smiled modestly. "I just bring food." Marcus shook his head. "You bring something else too." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Marcus thought for a moment. "Perspective." Thomas chuckled. "That sounds fancy." Marcus shrugged. "Guys who ride the road for decades sometimes forget things." "Like what?" Thomas asked. Marcus looked around the quiet farmhouse. "Like what real home feels like." Thomas grew thoughtful. "I suppose the road can't give you everything." Marcus nodded. "No, but it can lead you to places that matter." Just then, Derek glanced out the window. Another motorcycle was pulling into the driveway. But this rider wasn't part of the club. The bike was smaller, more official looking. Derek frowned slightly. "Looks like we've got company." Thomas stepped onto the porch. The rider removed his helmet. It was Jonathan Reed, the county investigator. He walked toward the house calmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." Thomas nodded. "Afternoon." Reed glanced briefly at Marcus and Derek. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Marcus crossed his arms casually. "Depends what you're here for." Reed smiled politely. "Just asking a few questions." Thomas gestured toward the porch chairs. "Well, you might as well join us." Reed sat down. For a moment he studied the peaceful farmyard. Then he turned to Thomas. "Your nephew spoke with me this morning." Thomas nodded slowly. "And?" Reed opened his notebook. "Let's just say his story raised more questions than answers." Marcus leaned back against the porch railing. He had a feeling the road ahead was about to change again. And somewhere across town, Daniel Carter was beginning to realize something important. His plan to quietly take his uncle's land was starting to unravel. Over the next few days, the quiet rhythm of the Carter farmhouse transformed into something almost lively. Thomas woke each morning to the distant, familiar hum of motorcycles on the gravel road. Sometimes it was Marcus and Derek riding by, sometimes other members of the Iron Road Brotherhood stopping for a brief visit. They never stayed long, but their presence alone had become a comfort Thomas hadn't realized he missed so deeply. The farmhouse kitchen smelled of simmering chili or fresh bread most evenings now, as Thomas began preparing meals to share with the bikers. It wasn't just food, it was a ritual, a way to say thank you to these men who had chosen to stand by him. One warm afternoon, Thomas leaned on the doorway of his kitchen, watching Marcus and Derek clean up the last of the coffee mugs. "You boys don't have to keep coming here," Thomas said quietly. "I appreciate it, but..." Marcus shook his head. "We're not just here because of the courthouse stuff, Dad. You've become part of the family." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Family?" "Yeah," Derek said with a grin. "Family shows up. You help us. We help you. That's how it works." Thomas nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. For decades, he'd lived alone since his wife passed. His children were scattered across the country, distant in both time and attention. And now, for the first time in years, he felt truly connected again. But the sense of calm didn't last long. A week after the courthouse evaluation, Thomas received a letter in his mailbox. The envelope had no return address, only his name written in clean, careful handwriting. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were documents from the county legal office. His heart sank slightly as he read. Daniel Carter had filed an appeal regarding the earlier evaluation. The nephew was not giving up. Thomas frowned, turning the paper over in his hands. "Looks like he's still trying," he murmured. At that moment, the familiar roar of motorcycles approached. Marcus, Derek, and three other bikers arrived in a neat formation, parking in the driveway. Marcus climbed off his bike, helmet in hand. "Looks like we might be needed again," he said calmly. Thomas smiled faintly. "I suppose we'll see what he tries next." Derek stepped closer. Whatever it is, he picked the wrong family to mess with. Over the next several weeks, Thomas's farmhouse became more than a home. It became a hub. The bikers stopped by regularly, sometimes just to share a cup of coffee, sometimes to swap stories of the road, and often simply to check on Thomas. They were always discreet, never interfering with his life more than needed, but their presence was unmistakable. Daniel Carter, on the other hand, was beginning to realize that his plans were being thwarted in ways he couldn't control. Developers were calling, offers were being made, but every attempt to pressure Thomas was countered, either by the legal investigation quietly underway or the unwavering support Thomas had gained from his chosen family. One evening, Thomas sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees. Marcus joined him, handing him a small prepaid cell phone. "Here," Marcus said, "one number program. Call me anytime, day or night, if you need help." Thomas took the phone, turning it over in his hands. "You really mean it?" Marcus smiled. "Family shows up." Thomas nodded slowly, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening sun. "I don't know how I ever thought I could face things alone." Derek and two other bikers joined them on the porch, bringing mugs of coffee. The group watched in silence as the first stars began to appear above the treetops. It wasn't just protection. It wasn't just loyalty. It was something deeper, a bond formed not by blood, but by choice, by honor, by shared values. Somewhere across town, Daniel Carter's reputation began to falter. Rumors of the investigation had reached developers, who began to back away from deals involving Thomas's property. Anonymous reports, carefully placed, were triggering scrutiny that Daniel couldn't control. And back at the farmhouse, Thomas realized that the bikers weren't just watching over him. They were creating a life around him, a family he could trust, a network of people who would stand by him through anything. That night, as Thomas prepared for bed, he placed the prepaid phone on his bedside table. He felt secure, knowing that no matter what Daniel or anyone else tried, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant hum of motorcycles riding into the night, vigilant, loyal, and unwavering. And for the first time in decades, Thomas Carter smiled as he drifted to sleep, knowing that some families weren't born, they were chosen. Weeks passed, and the tension that had gripped Thomas Carter's life slowly began to fade. Not because the threat had disappeared, but because the biker family around him had grown stronger, more vigilant, and more united. Daniel Carter's attempts to pressure his uncle were now not just failing, they were backfiring. Anonymous tips to county investigators, coupled with inconsistencies in his own claims, had drawn unwanted attention. Developers, wary of legal complications, began rescinding offers on Thomas's property. Every move Daniel made seemed to push him further into a corner, and his confidence, once unshakable, was now fragile. At the Carter farmhouse, the atmosphere was completely different. The front porch had become a gathering place, a sanctuary. Thomas would sit with Marcus and Derek in the evenings, sipping coffee and swapping stories. Sometimes bikers from the Iron Road Brotherhood would stop by, even without any pressing reason. They brought laughter, camaraderie, and the sense of shared purpose that Thomas had never known he was missing. One crisp Saturday morning, Thomas was in the kitchen preparing a batch of his famous chili when he heard motorcycles rumbling down the driveway. He stepped onto the porch to see Marcus, Derek, and three other bikers pulling up with warm smiles. "Morning, Dad," Marcus said as he helped Thomas into his coat. "Morning," Thomas replied, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Another day of peace, I hope." Marcus chuckled. "Depends, but we're here to make sure it stays that way." They all mounted their bikes and rode slowly toward the main road, enjoying the rhythm of the engines, the wind, and the quiet companionship of the road. Thomas had grown surprisingly comfortable on the back of Marcus's bike, feeling the reassuring steadiness of the man beneath him. As they rode past the town center, Thomas noticed a familiar dark sedan parked near the courthouse. Daniel Carter sat inside, staring at the motorcycles, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, their eyes met. Daniel's face betrayed a mixture of frustration, disbelief, and fear. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't just about property. It was about loyalty, honor, and the unbreakable bond Thomas had built with his chosen family. The bikers returned to the farmhouse later that afternoon, engines humming softly as they parked. Thomas was already waiting on the porch. "I don't know how to thank you all," he said quietly. "You didn't just protect my property, you protected my peace of mind." Marcus shook his head. "No thanks needed. You asked for a son, Dad. That's all we did." Thomas smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It feels like I finally have a real family again." Derek leaned against the railing. "Family shows up, Dad. That's what we do." Over the next few weeks, Daniel's schemes continued to unravel. Investigators uncovered irregularities in his attempts to claim control of Thomas's property, forcing him to sell his house and leave town quietly. His reputation, once polished and proud, became tarnished. The developers he had tried to manipulate pulled back entirely, leaving the land untouched. Meanwhile, Thomas's relationship with the Iron Road Brotherhood grew deeper. He brought Chili to the clubhouse, shared stories of his younger days in the army, and even joined in small rides along quiet back roads. The bikers welcomed him wholeheartedly, not just as a man they had protected, but as a true member of their chosen family. Years later, when Thomas was hospitalized with pneumonia, the bikers were the first to arrive. They took shifts at his bedside, making sure he was never alone. Marcus, Derek, and several others stayed through long nights, holding his hand, reading to him, and sharing quiet laughter that reminded him of home. One evening, as Thomas rested quietly, Marcus came to his bedside and said softly, "Family shows up." Thomas smiled, tears brimming in his eyes. "I know, I know." Outside the hospital, the Iron Road Brotherhood gathered for their weekly dinner. But this night, they were different. They weren't just a club. They were a family, a true family bound by loyalty, honor, and love, extending far beyond the events that had first brought them together. And in that moment, Thomas Carter understood something he had never fully realized before. Sometimes family isn't who you're born to. It's who shows up when you need them the most. The motorcycles roared softly into the evening, a testament to their enduring presence, their unwavering commitment, and the unspoken promise that no matter what storms life might bring, they would always be there. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long, the road difficult, but he was no longer alone, and that, more than anything, was worth everything. The sun was just beginning to set over the rolling hills surrounding Thomas Carter's farmhouse. The warm golden light painted the fields in soft hues, and the distant hum of motorcycles grew steadily louder along the gravel driveway. Thomas, now older and slower on his feet, but with eyes still bright and alert, stepped onto the porch. The aroma of fresh chili and baked bread wafted from the kitchen behind him, blending with the crisp evening air. Marcus and Derek led the Iron Road Brotherhood into the yard, each rider dismounting with careful precision. One by one, they removed their helmets and placed them on the wooden railing. 20 faces, some familiar, some newer, smiled warmly at Thomas, their presence steady and unthreatening, a living shield of loyalty. "Evening, Dad," Marcus said simply, his voice calm but filled with the quiet strength that Thomas had come to rely on. Thomas shook his head, a soft laugh escaping him. "You boys, you really didn't have to keep showing up." Derek stepped closer. "We know, but we want to. That's what family does." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't just gratitude. It was relief, comfort, and a profound sense of belonging he hadn't felt in decades. He realized that these men weren't here just to protect him. They were here to be with him, to share life's simple moments, to show that loyalty, honor, and friendship could form a family stronger than bloodlines. He stepped back into the house and returned with a large, steaming bowl of chili. The bikers gathered around the table set under the porch's wooden beams. Plates were passed, laughter flowed, and stories, some humorous, some poignant, filled the air. Hours passed and the evening grew cooler. Thomas stepped aside for a moment, looking out over the fields, now bathed in moonlight. He remembered all that had happened: the court battles, Daniel's schemes, the uncertainty, the fear. And he remembered every ride, every visit, every quiet gesture of solidarity from the bikers. Then with a soft sigh, he returned to the porch where Marcus was finishing his cup of coffee. "You know," Thomas said quietly, "I've lived a long life, fought in wars, faced hardships, and yet nothing prepared me for this, for knowing that someone would stand beside me, not because they have to, but because they choose to." Marcus nodded. "It's not about choice alone, Dad. It's about honor, respect, loyalty, and sometimes love." Thomas smiled, eyes misty. "I think I understand that now." The night deepened. Stars appeared above the farmhouse, and the gentle hum of motorcycles lingered as the bikers prepared to leave. Each man approached Thomas, giving him a firm handshake, a pat on the shoulder, a quiet word. "Call me if you need anything," Marcus said one last time. Thomas nodded. "I will. Thank you, all of you." One by one, the motorcycles started, engines rumbling softly into the night. Thomas watched as the taillights disappeared down the winding gravel road, leaving him alone in the quiet glow of the farmhouse porch. For the first time in many years, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. Not because the danger was gone, Daniel Carter's schemes had ended, but life would always hold challenges. But because he was no longer alone. He had a family now, a family of honor, loyalty, and unwavering moral courage. He sat quietly on the porch, taking in the gentle night air, feeling the warmth of the day lingering on the beams of the farmhouse. And he knew deep in his heart that no matter what the future held, he would never face it alone. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of a lone motorcycle riding along the highway, a promise of friendship, protection, and unwavering support. And for Thomas Carter, that sound had become the sweetest music in the world. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered softly to the night, "Family, they really do show up." And somewhere along the quiet roads and open highways, the Iron Road Brotherhood rode on, their presence a steadfast reminder that chosen bonds, forged in loyalty and honor, could overcome fear, greed, and isolation. A family built not by blood, but by courage, compassion, and the unshakable promise to stand by one another, always. The farmhouse stood in the moonlight, warm, alive, and full of stories yet to be shared. And for Thomas Carter, life had never felt more complete.